had a question for Chris. In thinking about this sort of building of a new paradigm for the grids and connecting them more with more transmission and things like that, is there a way to guard against the risk that demand would change in some unforeseen way? Like if we went back 20 years, probably we wouldn't have thought we would maybe have as much electrification at the household level as we have now, or something of that sort. So is there a way to build in some variability against changes, some distribution of what future demand might be?
Yes. The way the model was built and what we tried to do with the model is allow it to be disaggregated in roughly 250 regions across the US, and then each of those different regions can grow at different rates depending on migration. So we took migration patterns. So Americans are moving south in general, which is causing that disparity between winter and summer to be bigger than it used to be. There's more demand in summer and less in the shoulder seasons. And there's the model, when it does the demand management side, there's things in there that I don't really understand. I don't know how they're mapping, where it's doing things that it's smarter than I am. So I have to spend months understanding why it's changed the shape of the load in certain ways. And it does that dynamically, but there's also, you can change the inputs of what we project is going to happen as well. So that's a variable that we can change all the time, yeah.
Just one other quick question. Did you see any big scale storage units, or were these smaller units that got built, let's say, in residential areas?
Yeah, so there was big in California, near the solar sort of center. And if anyone wants to see a video of this dispatching, I have them on YouTube. But there's a big one in California, and then everywhere else it's kind of distributed towards the endpoints of the HVDC. So it's kind of, the model is matching it up with the DC lines to allow for, I don't want to say baseload because I don't really believe in that being the case, but it's allowing the utilization of the line to be, so you can ship it in the morning when it's not needed and store it at the endpoint and then use it locally rather than having the line work in the afternoon. Because one of the things in the model that I really want to make sure in there is that the losses go up as temperature goes up. So as the day goes on, you can't transmit as much power across the hot states, and so it tries to send stuff in the morning if it can to sort of belay that problem.
Hi, my question is for Sonia. Can you elaborate more on the modular nature of the grid design you're talking about? In particular, as I thought about the grid, when it comes to fossil fuel plants, so that limited amount of fossil fuel that we still need or eventually would need in the thing, having fewer of those where we could apply CCS or other technologies would be a lot better than having thousands of 50 megawatt cogens scattered everywhere. It's going to be very hard to get those cows back in the barn. So could you elaborate more on the modularity thing you're talking about?
Definitely, yeah. So I think you hit it right on the head with your question. I suppose I was not suggesting that we go modular with fossil fuels or certain other technologies, but just that I think in the past when we've tried to build generation, we've thought of it as these lumpy things where we can build a coal plant that's a gigawatt or many megawatts, and now we can sort of think about a much shorter time scale for building things like renewables or other sort of, run-of-river hydro, all kinds of different generation technologies that are that come in smaller units and can be built faster than sort of those large units used to be. But I totally agree. We don't want a proliferation of many small fossil fuel units that then we have to deal with.
Question for Chris. You mentioned at the beginning that the UK is different. It tends to be cloudy and stuff. And I thought that raises an interesting point about getting to 80%, which is that you can't do it unless you can develop solutions for essentially every place in the world, that you have different situations. So could you comment a little bit on the specifics for UK to put it into context and then address the bigger question of getting to everything?
Yeah. So my point with that is that each place needs to be thought of separately. So a solution that would work for the US, which has 4 time zones, is clearly going to be different to Europe that has 2, or Africa, which is huge, but has different problems with the ITCZ and things like that, and we want trees to keep emitting O2 rather than being cut down for plants. And so with the UK as a particular example, what we found with the model is that connecting much stronger ties to Norway and hydro and to Denmark and the other big states, which is what ENSO is doing, looking at connections to other areas. One of the reasons why we go offshore in the UK originally was to try and decorrelate, or correlate rather, to the demand. So they tried to do some quasi-analysis with DEC, Department of Energy and Climate Change, to look at, can we place these wind turbines in places where we could utilize the energy much more frequently, rather than it being distributed because they could only fit 1 or 2 wind turbines on farm. So one of the things I see in the UK when I drive around where I grew up with all the fields is there'll be 1 wind turbine, and then you'll be 50 miles before you see the next one, because they want to put them distributed, and then offshore you'll see these huge arrays going in. So it's a completely different solution. They still use solar. My mum is insistent on putting solar on the roof. I'm trying to dissuade her from doing that, partly because it's a 15th century house, and I just feel that would look a bit odd. But the capacity factors just aren't there unless you have some other source as well. And so in the light of Brexit and things like that, where we're getting a lot of our free or cheap power from France, helping grid manage with them is going to be difficult, seeing how they're going to go forward. And when I presented it today, they said, it's okay, we've got fracking, we're going to be good for energy. But they are still looking at how they can connect into the wider Europe grid. And then when we look further afield, other places like Africa, India, China, again, they've got very different... Sorry, that's me. It's me. So they've got very... We've got a lot of countries working together. Okay. I was running out of battery. When you go to these other areas where they don't need as large reliability, something I was talking to Briar over lunch is I'm not sure there's any analysis to know whether the reliability we have is absolutely necessary. If there was another 1 decimal place off, would that destroy the economy, or would it be noticeable? And so for the African countries, I found that connecting that together, you can get very, very cheap energy just from wind, solar, and gas, not including the hydro they have. And so they can do it, but then it becomes to, well, is that the right solution for those different countries? Because they've got very different stages of development, and would a massive continental scale grid be effective for them or not? And then with China, they've got the issues with how do you deal with their coal? Do you demand that they ramp? Do you demand what they're doing? And they're building a lot of HVDC, but it's all from the wind region straight to the cities. And India is a unique example for me because with the technologies we have now, looking at it, it's much more difficult to get to high penetration levels just because of the sheer volume of people and also the space that's available. And the good resource places are co-located to where people live. And so that makes it harder, which means we have to think about the problem slightly differently. But the same premise needs to go through. We need to think about what's best for that location and start thinking with weather in mind if you're going to use that as your fuel source, because that will run through right from planning all the way through operations. That was a long answer, sorry.
Both of you suggested that, well, at least marginal cost might not be what we face or dispatch order on. And I've always sort of thought that part of the problem is that we're not allowing price signals to propagate both on the demand side and on the production side. And so maybe it's the difference between marginal cost and levelized cost, but why wouldn't you want to always be deploying the least cost generation technology?
Sure, I can. I think you would always want to be deploying the least cost one, but it's just about the timescales on which you're dispatching these things, right? So in a world where we have very low marginal costs and we're not so dependent on fuel costs to determine that sort of hourly cost in comparison to other resources on the system. And in a world where we do really want to compare demand side resources on equal footing with supply side resources, we start to become dominated by resources that have such low marginal cost that it becomes not sort of the element that you want to build your system around or dispatch it around. So we then move into a kind of world where we have to be thinking about the overall levelized costs and to do least cost planning on a sort of much longer time frame. So not once it's built dispatching it, but we have to use least cost frameworks to build the whole portfolio of resources that we want to have available in the future. And then on a shorter time scale, it's more about how do you dispatch the pieces around the sides that you need for filling in that flexibility and variability.
But on the longer time scale, can just markets and prices do it, or do you need some kind of centralized planning, or
I think that different regions will handle that differently, and they already are handling that differently. Some regions really do look at long-term sort of centralized planning, and other regions are using markets. But I think the key element, at least for me, is that we need to change the way that when we are thinking about it from a market standpoint, we need to sort of make sure that the incentives are aligned toward that long-term very transformed system, and we've built our market incentives around a system that is, fossil fuel oriented and large centralized baseload plant oriented, and we need to start thinking about how to make those incentives for least cost kind of work for a system that looks a lot different. I don't know if you.
Yeah, just one comment. The way I've seen it is coal has already paid off pretty much, and so it's very cheap to dispatch it. The marginal cost is so small that it's only second to wind or hydro, or second or third to wind or hydro, and that's where the problem lies, because the real cost of the coal is hidden because it's already been paid off. And so how you remove them from a system without putting a carbon cap on doesn't happen in a least cost dispatch system, because the price of coal is so cheap that it will always be dispatched straight after hydro and wind. And also when you do with the PTC, wind goes negative, and that brings down the marginal cost for everybody. So everybody loses out. It's the whole wind eating its own lunch scenario, where everyone's profits go down. And if we can add in capacity into that market at the same time, it allows there to be a fairer, transparent cost signal of how much it really costs to have that wind on the grid, or the nuclear on the grid, or the coal on the grid to keep it running, because the coal doesn't want to get mothballed, and so it will bid against its own benefit in the short term to make sure it stays on for that lull it knows coming in 6 hours time, because if it turns off, that's it, it's off for 2 days. And so it will run at a loss for a short period of time to make sure that it can be available where it can make a profit. So just more and more signals coming in is really quite helpful, I think, to the market.
Great. I had two background type questions for Sonia. For Sonia, when you think about the issues with the transition from an AC to a DC grid, are you really talking about DC all the way to the end user appliances? And what are the issues associated with that? And for Chris, when we think about more integration in the system, and especially dealing with the regional interconnects, what can we currently move across the regional interconnects, and to what extent could we improve a system still going with regional interconnects, and to what extent do we have to erase it and start over?
Okay, so on the DC question, I think maybe partially the motivation is around there's certain safety issues that arise when you are putting DC into people's homes. There's some voltage and safety issues that can come, and I think there are certain advances in power electronics that can sort of help with those things, but I think that is one of the major sort of, when you talk about barriers or gotchas, that's definitely one that still needs some work before it could really scale and be safe. But I was talking about that in theory, because I think that the conversion from, if you have a lot of generation sources that are supplying in DC, and then you're converting to AC, and then transporting it, and then converting it back to DC for the vast majority of demand, you end up losing a lot in all of those processes, and we may be able to gain some efficiencies from starting to deliver DC. It's interesting, I think in Australia, in the more modern homes, there are, each electric plug also has a USB port, and I believe they're converting it back from AC to DC, but it's sort of interesting to start to think about, are we moving into a world where so much of the power that we use in at least residences and a lot of businesses are computing technologies and things that want DC power, so.
Still be stepping down.
Stepping down the voltage, absolutely, yes.
You can't transmit 5 volt.
No, definitely you'd have to step it up and down, but I think power electronics can help with that.
Replace your transformers with something which is functionally equivalent
Right,
to transformers.
right.
So I'm not convinced that's actually easier.
It might not be easier. I think that there are losses that are associated with the conversion to AC and then back to DC. That's kind of what we're thinking about here, rather than just the losses in the. Because I agree, you have to still go up. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Transformers are pretty darn good.
They are. It's true.
They need AC.
Yes, transformers do.
So Inez, I think, has a little comment.
Yes, so to that point of the overall diesel system, we did look at that in the situation of residential and commercial PV, so already at the distribution level. The bottleneck, like if you have a voltage standard, it helps with overcoming the safety issues. The biggest bottleneck was actually the DC appliances still being overly expensive. And so the only parts of the systems where this would become cost effective was HVAC systems and lighting with the LEDs. So those portions could pay off.
Yeah. So we've done some work on not a national grid, but looking at connecting the within the interconnects. So there's 3 interconnects in the US, and looking how they would act if we more integrated those. So WEC and then the Eastern and Texas kind of doing its own thing and hoping it works. And sometimes it wants to connect into the East, and sometimes to the West. And then we did an even I call it a worst case scenario where they stay within their NERC regions or within their markets. And what we keep finding is you can go through that bars, and then you can self-correct. So you can at some point you can say, okay, we're going to go to the interconnects, and then we're going to connect the interconnects more strongly than they already are. And NREL are doing a lot of work on that seam and looking at how connecting between the interconnects could really help with existing ties and maybe expansions. But what we find is that the solution to each of those questions is different because you've got to lift different area, and so what's optimal for, say, Florida is not the same as optimal for Florida when it's connected into the rest of the US. But that margin goes down when we have drivers that are related to the value to the grid rather than just the cost per kilowatt hour for that particular source, devoid of knowledge of the rest of the sources, which I found quite surprising when they were looking at bids in MISO. They literally just look at what it would cost for that generator, not knowing that generator was actually going to lose 2% of its generation because it's doing exactly the same as a generator 2 kilometers away. And so they both are going to lose out in the long run. And so the grid then ends up having to back it up more because you've got 2 sources doing the same thing. But the trajectory is, at the moment, we're about 4 billion overshoot from optimal of a national grid. And by 2018, we'll be 10 billion per year overshoot. And that grows faster and faster as we constrain ourselves. But $4 billion per year annual cost of buying electricity, because we have to lose electricity. There's things that we have to back up, and that interconnection. And so when you pay for that interconnection, that's the net difference. So obviously you're also paying for all this transmission as well. So that's an extra thing that you're spending in producing jobs and things. But essentially, if you do it in the right way, you can sort of transition a path. And so one of the things we're looking at is looking at going through those stages, but with an underlying part of the model having a probability that the national grid will happen at some point, and how would you deploy differently in these different markets with a, I don't know, I'm making this number up, but like 70% probability that it's going to stay as this single market, and then there's a 20% probability that the whole of the interconnect is going to tie in, and then there's a very small 10% that we're going to get a national grid. Where would you place your generators to hedge against that from becoming redundant? But expansion drives your cost down overall for all those different scenarios.
Klaus? We use the mic. It seems like some people can
Yeah.
hear the questions.
Question is mainly to you, Sonia, but also one of the observations I have, if you get smaller, you can actually even get dramatically smaller, which is not the same as being distributed. You could imagine that being a large cluster of small units. But just to set a scale, I'd like to point out that a car engine is approximately 100 times cheaper in capital cost than a power plant. And I'm talking about a coal plant. So that's the first observation. Secondly, it doesn't last very long, which actually helps with many of those decisions, because it does go away long before you ask questions what will happen 50 years down the road with our climate. So you really, but we have really a utility model, and so the question is what happens if you start pushing this very hard. And I see all sorts of things happen if you get a lot smaller, and I think we are now, this sounds like a planned economy, and I would argue if you had worried this much about the internet, we still wouldn't have it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also electricity has so many ingrained institutions where there are these financial models that have been set up around this prior system that was large, lumpy capital investments that, we needed a sort of trusted monopoly utility to undertake, and then we would pay them a fair return for this. But we've definitely come into a world where we have so many more options, and a lot of them are smaller, and a lot of them are going to be owned by third parties, and it's no longer sort of, it doesn't make sense for us to continue with the same utility model that we've had forever and ever, and that's 100% something that I think we need to solve in the near term to make way for the sorts of changes that we're talking about, getting to 80% and getting then certainly past 80%. Starting to pay utilities based on outcomes instead of giving them a rate of return on all their capital investments, I think can move us in the right direction, especially as we're trying to make sure that they're not pushing us in further into the same, ingrained path of large investments made by a single actor. So
The problem is, once my own PV panel is cheaper, and this is not the dispatch price, that's the levelized cost, I'm turning off the utility, and then the whole system collapses.
yeah, that's exactly why we need to solve that utility model sooner rather than later, because if they keep increasing cost to cover their sort of assets that are being underutilized, then we're going to get into that situation a lot faster. And I think I would imagine that most people in the room agree that an integrated system is going to be much more cost effective societally than a bunch of small islands of people trying to do their own thing. So got to solve that.
Okay, so we have 35 minutes left for discussion. I have everyone down, and we'll hopefully get through everyone. Other questions after that? Great. Jack.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy you brought up the P2G2P, power to gas to power concept, one that I feel close to, but also one that you didn't mention has the possibility of also supporting transmission of resources if you use the natural gas grid. And I didn't hear you say that you actually incorporated that aspect of P2G2P in your modeling. And I'm wondering if you did, because it's not just access to that natural gas market, but also the potential to move that energy around in society that is a huge benefit of that concept. And I have one second question too.
Yeah, go. So it is. So it goes into the pipeline, and the model will move it to where it's going to need it next. depending on, so there's capacity to obviously how much it can store and where it can go, and it does smart things like they're overproducing, that it then produces the gas, but it knows later on it's going to need the gas somewhere else, and it doesn't want to send electrons to electric storage, so it sends the natural gas through the pipelines that do exist. There's no expansion of that yet, that's not built into the model yet, but it's just the existing grid with the existing storage and how it can flow it about. So it does do some smartish things like that, but it certainly isn't, allowing like big pipelines to be extra built in to do this. I think that would be a very interesting next step.
Yeah. The second question might be for either of you, and I'm wondering if you have concerned yourselves with the waveform time scale to any significant extent, because currently the system at the waveform level depends upon the rotating moment of inertia of all these technologies, and you kind of touched upon that when you talked about the DC topic. And the stability of our grid depends upon a big portion of the electricity coming from that. But almost all of the scenarios you guys are talking about, it's mostly inverter-based technologies. And we don't currently allow the inverter-based technologies to support this volt-var control and things like that that could possibly provide that reactive power and stabilize the waveform. And there are complications if we do allow it to do that. So there's a whole bunch of questions around the physics of managing the grid stability also that I wonder if you guys could address.
I'll quickly answer what the model can do. So we allow the model to use the wind power for synthetic inertia, as they call it. I think it's a terrible name, but short-term transients. So it solves those equations. So it goes through and does like a subroutine where it's solving. So it's an hourly model at the moment, but it goes into a much finer resolution to look at balancing the frequency with these different resources. And we find it makes a bit of a difference to where you place the things, so that you've got this forecast error is removed a bit, because that's where you can get some of these big transient events. But a lot of the rotating steel is needed because there's a lot of rotating steel on the grid that needs to be counterbanded or counterbalanced with the reactive power. And so there's things that are in the model, but it's not 100% deals with it fully in every respect. But we put in the things that Bri and others are working on in terms of solar PV can inject ways of doing that as well. But we don't deal with that on a large scale.
I'll just add that I think you alluded to this a bit too, but if you sort of decrease the real power output of a lot of these inverter-based technologies and use some power electronics to change the power angles, yes, they definitely, technologically, there's no reason why they can't do this. This is, I think, again, a problem with market design and with enabling different technologies to be able to provide, the services that have traditionally been provided by the larger scale ones, and valuing that and beginning to pay for it, I think you would see a lot more.
Is it actually necessary?
Well, I think that's another question, because
fall apart?
go ahead.
So for one great example of that is Ireland has a limit where they only allow 50% asynchronous generation at any time. And they've never run into any issues with that, and they're actually looking at increasing that level right now. We've looked at scenarios with up to instantaneous penetration of 75% asynchronous generation, with and without allowing power electronics, sort of synthetic inertial things. And if you are willing to go through a little bit more of an idea of your frequency, you can do it without synthetic inertia. Synthetic inertia helps you to arrest it a little bit quicker. And as you're alluding to, the key thing here is either enforcing plants to provide the service or incentivizing that service.
Okay, so this is a question for Chris. So with your model, you concluded that there's 20% that you can't get out of the system in terms of having to have a dispatchable, controllable power. And I'm wondering, have you looked at that 20% and do an optimization, an inverse model? What is it in that remaining 20%? What are the attributes that would make the ideal gap-filling technology or technologies, and where are they located, and what kind of functionality do they have? So do you, I mean, because if you knew the answer to that, then, you know, that'd be, you know, wonderful. Then everyone could run out and make one.
When I say 80%, I mean cheaper than today from the model. So 100% is easily doable with the resource we have. It's just going to be hugely wasteful. And so when you try and make it very, very valuable for cost, what we find is there's the afternoon peaks between when the solar's ramping down and the wind's going up. So hydro is a really good candidate, I think, if they change the way they were running. And I know that people need to do their water sports and things like that, so that might not be as important. But the way they run that would get away nearly 5 to 7, maybe 10% of that total yearly thing. And then the second one is harder. It's the really big peaks in summer where there's just not the value isn't there in the model to have that extra PV shedding for a lot of the year. Yeah, it's just the overgeneration starts really hitting the cost. So as the costs come down, that would be storage would fill that diurnal thing if you had storage that was cheap enough and would scale enough for the Western. So, and an interesting thing is the West is almost entirely carbon free. So it's 99 something %. And there's one gas plant which is in Arizona, and that's it. The rest of it is all green, and that's partly due to low demand and high resource availability. And then the East is where the fossil fuels really remain. And so part of it is transmission being cost effective, part of it is storage, part of it is hydro. With all those three things, if they work differently, we've run the model through to get 100% with 11 cents rather than the 10 cents. So it's still a 10% increase. So it's doable, but it then starts getting more and more hard as you add new sectors in. So when you add the cars in and you add the planes in, then you've already sort of maximized your decorrelation effect. And then you need to bring in something else that could be overgeneration, and P2G2P sort of has filled the gap in the model so far, but that's just sort of a black box of unknown, do something to get power moved about. And so that's the main thing, is the evening lull in wind, the solar going down and the wind going up is the biggest, easiest low-hanging fruit I can see that could be almost entirely eliminated. Either CSP or hydro could do that, but the costs need to be there, and regulation needs to change for that. Because hydro is kind of bounded by where you can place it at the moment.
You've talked some about differences across countries, and for both grid modernization and deep deployment of renewables, I was hoping you could comment on how to think about the technical challenges and opportunities as you go from US and UK to countries like Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Haiti, and down at the low-income country status, you could think about there actually being some opportunities for doing some serious leapfrogging. So for expanding energy access in a deep decarbonization mode, what do we know right now?
Not a huge amount, but if we could spend 100 billion in Africa and build a continental grid, so there are two huge big things, you can get extremely cheap wind and solar. There's a lot of wind over the Sahara. The solar's okay over the Sahara, but you've got dust issues. But it's an area that's kind of not utilized at all. Countries like Somalia have great wind resources. Kenya has great wind resources, so really big countries like that, and they can ship power long distances. So for Africa, building a continental grid makes more sense even than the US in some ways, because they can get energy costs down to 3.5 cents for all energy versus 10 cents here, because they have such a large area to take from. But there's a huge problem with 48, 49 countries agreeing on who pays for what and where, which is hard enough with 48 states. So for that, and then for other countries like India that I've looked at, and more densely populated countries, I still don't know what the exact answer is. I find it difficult to see wind and solar being able to be the largest component to those countries without really, really cheap storage that can fit somewhere that you can put it underground or something, because just the space constraints are very large on those countries, and that's kind of all I can really go into.
I'll just add, I don't know if this is going to come off sounding not good, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that in a lot of these countries, we don't have 100% universal access, and reliability is not something that's kind of assumed by society. And when we come at these questions from such a U.S. perspective, we're kind of trying to solve this with reliability being this majorly tight constraint that we must maintain no matter what. And I think, you know, a lot of opportunities start to open themselves up when you have sort of a scenario where power is available for certain hours a day and not available at other times. And that's just kind of the way that sort of things have evolved for now. And, you know, that might buy us a little bit of time as we start to solve those problems for other places of reliability and power being available all the time. We might have some time in between to build up some of those, you know, sort of systems that don't necessarily need to have every single minute of the day filled in with some technology.
Doug? Let's see. Just a couple of quick comments. So, on what the future might look like, I mean, we've started to actually map out options for what a economic paradigm would look like when the bulk of the system is zero marginal cost. So think about services as aspects, things like that, other aspects that basically would drive operational decisions and also reflect in markets. So that's an option. And Sonia was absolutely correct that if you have the bulk of everything being zero marginal cost, then you can't make a decision if everything's bidding in at zero, right? So the market wouldn't dispatch.
If everybody bids zero, that's not a sustainable business.
That's correct. That's why you have to move away from energy.
But that means they can't bid zero on a sustained basis, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we could play that out, but really.
He's right. I actually looked at it some time ago with students. What will happen is if I own a panel, let's say, and I have no cost, I will bid zero.
Yeah,
right?
I think
But then what happens is I will never build another one.
Yeah, but I think you can treat it as an initial condition problem, or you can treat it as a steady state problem. These are two end members.
Yeah.
And so if you have an initial condition problem, you've spent all this capital, then you're in your state. But if you're saying, you know, when you have some kind of system, that people are going to have to recover their capital costs.
But we don't live in an energy-only world now. We have capacity markets in a number of places, and that's one option that you can have in order to establish that. The one reason some of these larger thermal plants are on is because of capacity payments. Now, you could go to the opposite extreme and take the Australian example, where they just do scarcity pricing. So they have no upper bound on bidding, and so you have 5 hours a year where it costs $5,000 per hour or something, and that provides the sort of investment to keep these things on. And so there are a number of different options, but we don't live in an energy-only world now. We have all these other services available. So going out to further services really isn't that much of a leap.
That's one. So I'll actually, instead of more comments, I'll actually ask a question. So mostly for Sonia, but Chris, feel free to chime in, which is for that last 20%, again, the premise of coming in, are the difficulties of achieving that last 20%, in your view, more institutional, or are they more technical, and or are they both equal?
I think I come at it from that institutional lens so I think it's an evolution, right? I think that the pressing challenges, even for getting to that last 20%, are institutional changes, because that's how we set ourselves on a path toward getting to that last 20%, even being a conversation we can have. But I think once you're at that last 20%, the dispatch software and algorithms and how you decide which services you're going to dispatch the grid based on, and all of those types of questions, I think those are still open, R&D questions, although hopefully you guys have answers for those things. But I don't think that as far as, I don't think that we don't have all of the bases of the technologies that we're going to need. You know, I definitely think that capital cost coming down is going to be a really huge deal, but I tend to think that changing the institutions and changing the systems level integration, software, dispatch, platforms will be the R&D challenges that go along with that. I don't know.
I'll just say one small thing about it is I think we do have the technologies. I think we can easily put them together. I think one of the things that we're doing, and NREL are doing a great job of it, is looking at how you put all these different things together. Because at the moment we've got the technology, but how we fit them all together and how we convince the institutions to do that is the bit that I think is the barrier. They've done it a certain way for a long time, and they've just started to get a handle on wind and solar, and now we're saying demand management, we're saying all these things that they're really scared of. They're slow at changing, and if these studies can do it and show the technical barriers aren't really there, they're just sort of inertia in the human consciousness that actually all these technologies work and we can put them together in all these different ways and they can work. So actually there's a lot of redundancy built into that. I think that's the main barrier for that last 20%. But we've still got a long way to go. We've got time.
Okay, well, Ken's whispering. So I have a clarification question, but it's probably more like I'm just asking Chris to agree with what I think the take-home message is on two fronts. One, to answer or address Sally's question. I've read this paper and heard Chris twice, so I'll try to see if this is the right message. If you agglomerate wind and solar, but predominantly wind over continental scale with high voltage transmission, one can see a system that gets to 80% of carbon emission reduction from wind and solar. But the attribute that is an issue is that there are days, weeks, when you need to fill essentially 100% of that capacity with something else. And I think that's what the model shows to address. Is that right?
No.
No. So
it's close.
It's close. It's maybe
close.
90%. Okay, so I misstated a little bit.
It's more like 60%.
Of the wind and solar, or of the total?
Of the wind and solar.
Well, I thought there were summer days when the wind hardly blew across the United States, and so every night you were filling essentially 100%.
No. I mean, during the summer at night, there's some howling winds in the Central Plains. There are some periods where there are lulls, and because it's a cost model, sometimes it decides that not burning gas for the carbon kind of idea would cost more money than to burn the gas. And so there's the way it places it. So in the model, there's also what's called the variability mitigator. So you can remove all those variabilities, but it costs you 30% more. But the point of the model is that there are some periods that are a few days long, normally 3 to 4, right, where you have to fill, on average, is about 50%. But there's a peak of 60% that you need to do it. But the way the model works is it looks through this 10 years of data, right, and finds that 50% where it happens to be a very low load period at the same time. So there's some things, so there's lots of options. So another way to frame it, to answer your question, is there's around 10 billion solutions within $100 annual cost that we found.
Sure.
And I've not gone through all of them. But basically you can shuffle things around where you can move that peak to some other time. You can do some different things with it. So this is just the absolute minimum cost. We're not caring about how much carbon we're burning. So if you turn on the variability mitigator, you can make it only have 20% filled up with backup, but that will cost you 7% more.
Because you've overbuilt something else.
Not necessarily overbuilt. You've built in places that are less valuable to the grid.
Same thing.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Okay.
So we brought that point out. So Sally, it kind of looks like a gas plant, basically, is what would be the attribute that would fill. Second point is power to gas to power. We'll hear more about that in the context of electricity to fuels later. That's an important potential crossover technology that is not cheap now, because of course gas to power is 30% efficient, and to go the other way involves taking your precious electricity you made from 3 joules of gas and then putting it into a system that makes that gas back again so you can store it to get 30% again efficiency back at the other side. So this is a key and principal enabling technology as a crossover. It really involves electricity to hydrogen to make that gas, which is what the foundational cost technology step is. I think that's right.
I agree that it's foundational, but the point that the model does is it takes the curtailed energy, which is essentially free, and uses that, which is where a lot of the cost would have been. So the efficiency obviously has a big driver on it, but because you're using the free energy that would have otherwise been wasted, it's where it makes cost recovery comes in.
Sonia, did you have a question for us there?
A question? No, I guess I was just going to say I don't want the takeaway to be that we need 100% backup if we move to a high renewable future, because I really also think that thinking about it from the cost minimization standpoint is really important and will drive a lot of the decisions. But right now, today, we have huge reserve margins already built. So in a sense, we've already overbuilt the system. And I don't think that that's necessarily wrong, right? Because we know that certain of the existing generation that we have now won't always be available. And we have these huge chunks that might come down in one fell swoop at any moment. So we have to build 20% more or something than we actually demand on a yearly basis just to fill those gaps in. So I don't think that it's necessarily this scenario where just because the cost minimization piece had a 50 or 60 even percent backup requirement that somehow means that we're doing something worse or wrong in the long run if we move in that direction. Does that make sense?
We'll talk about it.
I was wondering if we could talk a little more about flexibility from hydro resources, because I haven't seen that much discussion about it, and I imagine lots of people in the room have things to say, but it seems like models make drastically different assumptions about flexibility. I know the original news model basically just took historical outputs as inputs. Some models assume entire flexibilities. The switch model, which I worked on, had kind of monthly balancing constraints. Do we know how flexible hydro resources are? Does it matter whether we're talking about large dams versus run of river? I think answering that question is really key to whether or not it's underappreciated or overhyped, and whether or not it's a really key part of this question or not.
I can have one stab at it. So when I reran the news model where I allowed it to be flexible, so what I said allowed the model to do was say it could dispatch up to what it was dispatched at, no higher, but then could be dispatched down to 0. So I assumed that all the water was spilled, or the model assumes that it was spilled. And then I found that the optimization found 85% carbon free. So you got an extra 5% just by allowing it to, basically, instead of always dispatching to load follow, you were dispatching to it was load following, but to the residual after you've taken out the wind and the solar. So that is a key constraint. But unfortunately, there's a lot of different things that constrain the hydro that I think really make it tough, particularly downstream users. So you can't just hold behind a dam and hold the water there indefinitely, because it needs to be used for agriculture and needs to be used for other things, and that's a good thing. But on the other hand, obviously, if it was just for energy, it would make it better. We're also kind of constrained where we can build new ones. We can retrofit and we can put dams with new things in them. But when I allowed the model to do that and allowed it to expand it, it put in 3 times the capacity that exists today, and we got up to 90% with this extra flexibility. But I don't know, it doesn't get us all the way there. And again, I'm a bit naive to know every single last thing, because when I went to BPA, I sat there for a day and was kind of dumbfounded by all the different things. All the salmon are coming, so we need to turn this off. And I was like, okay. So it's a whole different world, and I think relying on that more would be a good idea. It's just making sure that we keep all the other things in check. And run of river is obviously a bit easier to dispatch, because you can either have the generator generating or not, but the water's gone, whereas the dams could give you some storage in theory. But with the droughts constantly happening is making it more and more difficult to argue it, and all the dams are silting up, so we have to go into the argument of, are we going to spend the money dredging them and getting them back up to full capacity or not? So there's a lot of different things we need to do for hydro to make it more accessible for grid work.
I just wanted to come back to this point around reliability, both in the context of the developing world and the developed world. I think first on the developing world, if we start to think that they could use less reliable power than we do, we're making some assumptions about how they're going to develop their economies. And what you'll see in India is the mini grids are starting to take off because of reliability of power. It's more expensive, but at least it's there. And I think, if you think about a country either having a tourist economy, tourists want the air conditioning lights when they want it. If you have a heavy industry, you can't turn the power off. And if you're running a high-tech industry economy, then power quality and reliability is super important. And what you see in the US, and you actually see it in developing countries, is when people don't have reliable power, they figure out ways to get it, and they'll be willing to pay for it. And I would argue here in the US, if we started having intermittency in our power, Americans would just buy backup generators, which is what they do in my town, where the trees fall down all the time. So I think in a way, there's probably an economic argument that says, 99.9%, if you drop decimal point, it will work. But people will do not the climate reacting thing and say, oh, the power's out. They'll figure out a way around it. So perhaps as a simplifying assumption for what we're all trying to do is we should assume the current characteristics of a modern economy and its reliability of power, and assume that also that's what developing countries are going to demand, and we can't give them a second-class system. So if we do that, at least we know which way we're angling. So that's a comment more than a question, but either one of you might want to respond to that.
I'll just quickly say I agree. I think we need to aim for that. I think where I come from is the path of least resistance is to get as many people electrified as quick as possible with low carbon sources, and then work towards 100% reliability or close to it. Otherwise, I feel like you say, if we don't do that, try and get them to 100%, they'll go to fossil fuels because that is 100% quote unquote reliable, and that's going to be their backup go-to. But thank you.
8 minutes left, so I'm going to cut it off after. We'll get to everyone with their questions now and cut it off there.
Just sort of a clarification question. If you look at what happened to the financial system and mortgages in 2008 or thereabouts, is that you had unexpected correlations in your in your system which weren't included to begin with. So can you imagine some here, like climate change, an exceedingly cold winter, volcanic eruptions, where you actually now get cross correlations on the continental level?
Yeah, so one of the big things that we tried to look at is how the wind turbines will interact with the atmosphere and change downstream resource. One thing. I looked at, there's a guy called Gil Compo at NOAA who's got a reanalysis data set that goes back to 1851. So they managed to do a reanalysis going back to 1851 to look at this exact question of how the climate's changing and how a grid would look in 1851 versus now. And there's some really striking things that can have big effects, but they seem to be very much short-lived and within the bounds of for the news model. Luckily, we didn't design it that way, but the reserve margin in there would have covered anything that happened in that time period, if you believe the data, which obviously going back to 1851 might be a bit more tough to believe, but deals with it. But there's things like solar eclipses and things like that Germany just recently had to deal with, and so they suddenly realized, hey, the whole country now is dark in the middle of the day. And they actually did the right thing, which was they used it as an experiment, which was the opposite to what the Italians did, which was turn all the PV off. for the whole day, so then they didn't have the ramp. But the Germans went and said, well, this is the ramp we're going to get every day when the solar eclipse finally goes past, and we're going to get this huge upramp in solar. Can we deal with it? And this was the whole country basically blacked out for a few hours and ramped up again. And they found that now that they can predict where it's going to be and the clouds and things like that, they actually dealt with it really well, and they didn't need any more reserves than it. So people are really starting to think about these big-scale correlations. The big unknown to me and the big question mark that I think everybody should be working on, including myself, is how climate change is going to impact the clouds and the winds. Because at the moment, from the models that I've seen, the winds in the US are certainly moving north and slowing slightly. And so longer term, if we don't, that's my driver for wanting to get things done more quickly, is that longer term there may not be a solution as easily accessible as there is now, because the resource is changing, but I don't think anyone fully knows how it's going to finally play out. And so, yeah, I agree there's going to be some big things that need real research done on it.
We have 4 minutes for questions.
Well, so I basically want to push back a little bit on the institutional versus technological needs, and I think especially in the last 20%, I do think that the institutional challenges are the primary challenge, especially getting from 0 to 80, or wherever we are to 80, excuse me. And I also think that they might be the more challenging of the two problems. We mostly have the technologies to get us to about 80. But the last 20, I think we have things that we don't know yet how to do, and I think it's especially challenging when you get into things like making fuels that can be used in aviation, fuels that can be used in heavy-duty transportation, and how you do that, I don't know. And even like this power-to-gas concept, okay? There are many technologies that I think we don't yet have, and we need to invest in order to make that a reality, especially that last 20%. So it's mainly a comment. I hope you consider it as you go forward.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to the energy. So there's so much interest in flexibility and variable generation and small and distributed. And I guess from my perspective, I haven't heard a compelling case that really any of those things are particularly good. It's more grappling with the reality of what we're trying to accomplish with carbon. So if we go back to really thinking about an ideal electricity system, if one were to ask, okay, what's the optimal baseload? Imagine you had zero emission baseload power. That was primarily, baseload, so you can ramp it maybe a little. And is that 10% that we'd like to have? It's 20%? Is it 30%? And at what cost? So right now, nuclear power perhaps doesn't look very attractive, or something equivalent to that. If you could have, zero carbon baseload power at 5 cents a kilowatt hour, how would that change our views about what the electricity system should look like? That might deviate from sort of the path we're on, which is putting more intelligence, more controls, more complexity, more microprocessors, which in and of themselves, from a sustainability perspective, we have to invest energy in every one of these gadgets. We have to mine materials. So what would be wrong with having a much simpler system if we could really get to zero emission baseload power?
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think what we tried to do with our work is to be simple, so there's no magic demand response. I mean, the latest versions have demand response in it, but show kind of the same characteristics. So trying to keep it simple, the old KISS analogy, keep it simple, stupid. Trying to do that, and then I would just look at the energy return on investment. How much energy are we having to put in to deal with all these different technologies, and is it better to invest that energy rather than investing in researching a simpler technology or things like that? I personally don't want to see nuclear going away too quickly. That's just my personal opinion, because I feel it's doing a good job at the moment of keeping us somewhat carbon mitigating. But I mean, it's going to go away to some degree, and we're not really sure how we're fully going to replace that. I've done runs where we've replaced it, and you end up with a bit more carbon emitted, and you end up with higher costs. But you you get close to the same answer, roughly. It's just that it costs a bit more and you get a bit more carbon. And so is that the right path, or do we want to... and so to me, I'm sort of all of the above. We want to be researching lots of different things and deploying what we know we can deploy now, in the hope that some genius somewhere will give us that last, or many geniuses give us those last bits. And if each of them does 5%, that's good. We can add them all together and work together.
If you look at really what's happening in California, is we've committed to a pathway. We've made a decision to close our last nuclear power plant, and the momentum is there, and consequential decisions are being made. There are no plans to invest in new nuclear in that area, and I just wonder, nobody's making the case. There's no articulate, well thought out study, research, quantified effort to make the case that if we had something that was zero emission, at a base load of 30%, that would make the overall energy system cheaper and more efficient and so forth.
Sorry, just a quick clarifying question on, this isn't my question, but what you just said, Chris. So in that scenario, what did you assume about nuclear? The one where you said costs go up by a little bit, but
yeah, so
it grows significantly, or it's just replacement of current plants?
Yeah, so I don't do any fudging for opportunity costs or anything. I basically just go. In this one scenario, you're allowed the nuclear that exists today, and it will continue to run to 2030. And then the other scenario, say, at some point between now and 2030, all your nuclear is disappearing. How do you fill it? And what you end up finding is you have more wind and solar by about 29% to replace all the nuclear. But because you have the variability there, you do end up with a slight increase in costs and emissions, because transmission and the wind and solar are constrained in some way because the United States is only a finite size, and so you end up with a bit more emissions. And we've done a few studies where we push nuclear up to 50-60% and down to 10%, and as Saleh was saying, it can make a difference, but unfortunately, as I think we all understand, not everything's about cost. It's about the social side as well, and so that's
right.
Where nuclear became difficult.
Right, investors have to want to invest in technologies for them to take off. Okay, so my question is actually
so
for...
into our break time, so quick on both ends, please.
Okay, quickly, mostly for Sonia, I guess, what are your thoughts on demand response as a way to, some would argue, one of the only ways to deal with high frequency fluctuations in supply from renewables? I mean, is this a large scale solution, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, definitely. I think it is. I think between here and 80%, it's a huge deal. And I think the work that Doug was mentioning earlier this morning in California to characterize the technical potential for demand response is really interesting stuff that bears looking at, because there's some neat pieces in there, and there's some costs associated with each of those different sources of demand response, at least as of today. But I think once we get to that last 20%, it does start to become a more open question. How much of that last bit can demand response really play? I mean, it definitely can help us get to 80, but I guess You mean in terms of like clouds coming over and variations that way? I do. I think it has to be invisible to the end user, and it has to be driven by technology that can kind of handle this behind the scenes. But I definitely. There's pieces in that study. There's a lot of companies that are starting to look at that. We should talk more for sure.
Comment about to what degree hydropower is dispatchable. It actually depends on each individual water reservoir, because most of the hydropower station is not just only for power generation. They need to supply water and have other consideration. And I like to think that all conventional hydropower is already a pump hydro, because Mother Nature is doing the pumping. So when Mother Nature is pumping fast enough, we don't need to pump. But if it's too slow, so we cannot dispatch that, then we can add a pump to help.
Okay, thank you.
Very nice.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'll just end by saying that was all about electricity. There's lots of other things we're going to talk about. The last 20% of electricity is not the last 20% of transportation and other things. So, great session. We'll be back at 4 p.m., I believe, and we'll be talking about storage, electricity storage. Awesome. Thank you guys.